The crowd was ready. The stage was ready. The guitars were ready. Then Oasis died before the first song. Not with a farewell speech. Not with a final bow. Not with a dramatic last chorus, where everyone could pretend they understood what they were losing. Just a backstage explosion. A broken dressing room piece, a cancelled show. Thousands of fans waiting outside while one of the biggest bands Britain ever produced collapsed behind a door. That is the cruel joke of Oasis. They made millions of people sing about escape, hope, youth, defiance, and being bigger than the life you were born into. Then they could not escape themselves. For years, Oasis had looked indestructible from the outside. Loud guitars, stadium crowds, beer-soaked confidence, Manchester swagger, songs that did not ask politely for your attention. They kicked the door open and acted like the door had been built for them all along. Very modest, very Oasis. They did not just become famous, they became a national mood. To fans, Oasis sounded like the moment your boring street suddenly had a sky over it. Like ordinary people could stand taller for 4 minutes. Like a council estate dream had found an amplifier and decided subtlety was for cowards. But inside that sound was a problem. The same fire that made Oasis feel alive was also eating the band from within. The arrogance sold records. The chaos made headlines. The insults became entertainment. The fights became part of the brand. And the public loved it because the public always loves danger when someone else is paying for it. But a band cannot live forever as a controlled explosion. Sooner or later, the explosion stops being controlled. Oasis did not fall because the songs ran out. The songs survived. The band did not. That is the story. Not just a rock breakup. Not just another tale of fame, money, drugs, and ego doing exactly what fame, money, drugs, and ego usually do. This is the story of a band that gave Britain a voice, gave the world anthems, and then turned its greatest strength into the weapon that destroyed it. To understand why that final backstage fight mattered, we cannot begin in Paris. We have to go back to Manchester. Before Knebworth. Before Wonderwall. Before the newspapers made the war a national sport. Back to the place where Oasis learned the first rule of survival. If no one hands you a future, make enough noise until they look up. Oasis did not come from a world that rewarded softness. Manchester in the early 1990s was not selling fairy tales. It was selling work, unemployment, rain, football, cheap rooms, old factories, and young men pretending they were not scared of disappearing. That is where Oasis made sense. They were not delicate. They were not tasteful. They did not arrive like art school boys, explaining their influences with expensive sadness. They sounded like 5 lads who had decided the whole country was too small for them, and somehow made that arrogance feel reasonable. That was the first magic trick. Oasis turned ordinary frustration into scale. A bedroom did not feel like a bedroom anymore. It felt like a launch pad. A bad job did not feel like a life sentence. It felt like something you could sneer at on your way out. A gray street did not feel romantic, but Oasis made you believe something huge could still come from it. The band began before the world knew the name properly. There were rehearsals, rough gigs, borrowed confidence, and the usual early band mess. People trying to look certain while nothing around them was certain at all. Then, the missing piece arrived. The songs. That is where Oasis stopped being just another loud local band. Noel Gallagher brought structure, hooks, choruses, a sense that the music could be simple and enormous at the same time. Liam Gallagher brought something harder to explain and easier to hear. The voice. Not technically perfect, better than perfect. It sounded bored, angry, young, arrogant, wounded, and immortal all at once. He sang like he was leaning against the whole world and daring it to move him. That voice could make a simple line feel like a brick through a window. The combination was dangerous. One brother had the songs. One brother had the sneer that made the songs walk into the street. The rest of the band gave it muscle. Bonehead's guitar made the wall. Giggsy and Tony McCarroll held the early engine together. And suddenly, Oasis had something more powerful than polish. They had belief. Belief is stupid when it fails. When it works, people call it destiny. The band did not yet have stadiums, but it had the feeling of stadiums. That was enough. Then came the debut album. And Britain heard the sound of people who had not been invited to the party kicking the door clean off. Definitely Maybe did not sound like a debut album asking to be liked. It sounded like a band already offended that the world had taken so long to notice. That is why it hit. From the opening attitude to the last crash of guitars, the album felt like working-class confidence with no interest in behaving itself. Oasis did not whisper their ambition. They printed it in capital letters and turned the amp up. Very subtle stuff. The record arrived in 1994 and immediately gave people a version of themselves that felt larger. Not smarter, not richer. Larger. That matters. A great debut does not only introduce a band, it introduces a permission slip. For Oasis fans, definitely maybe said, you are allowed to want more. You are allowed to be bored by the life assigned to you. You are allowed to walk into a room like you already own the exit. That is not just music. That is emotional theft in reverse. The band stole confidence from rock history and handed it to kids who needed it. Of course the critics noticed. Of course the press noticed. Of course the machine noticed. And once the machine notices, it starts decorating the cage. Oasis were suddenly not just a band. They were a movement, a headline, a threat, a laugh, a problem, a promise. They were Manchester with guitars. They were the anti-polish. They were rock and roll with a football crowd chest. The mythology built fast. Too fast, probably. But speed was part of the point. Oasis had no interest in the slow climb. The band moved like it had a bus to catch, and the bus was called history. Yet inside the triumph, the future cracks were already visible. The arrogance was thrilling. The arrogance was also expensive. The interviews were funny because they were rude. The rudeness was funny until it was not. The brotherly tension gave the band electricity. It also put a fuse under everything. At first, the fuse looked like personality. Rock audiences love personality, especially when it comes with swear words and a haircut. But personality becomes dangerous when nobody can turn it off. Definitely maybe made Oasis matter. Then the next album made them enormous. And being enormous is where the real damage began. Because once the whole world started singing, Oasis had to live inside the noise they had created. The second album did not just make Oasis bigger. It made them unavoidable. What's the story? Morning Glory turned the band from British phenomenon into global property. Suddenly, the songs were not only coming from speakers in bedrooms and pubs, they were coming from taxis, television sets, American radios, stadiums, college rooms, wedding playlists, and every place a chorus can be abused by drunk people who think volume equals emotion. To be fair, with Oasis, sometimes it did. The songs were built for mass participation, not private admiration. You did not delicately appreciate Oasis, you joined in. That was the power. Wonderwall became a cultural virus with an acoustic guitar. Don't Look Back in Anger became public therapy. Champagne's Supernova sounded like youth trying to explain itself while already forgetting the question. The titles alone became part of the language. And Oasis became the band people used when they wanted to feel something uncomplicated for once. Hope, regret, escape, defiance. The belief that life could still open. But success at that size does something ugly to a band. It does not only reward the best parts, it rewards everything. The talent, yes. The attitude, yes. The chaos, too. The public did not just buy the songs. It bought the fights, the insults, the swagger, the brother war, the idea that Oasis might collapse at any moment and still somehow sound like victory. That is a very profitable illness. The press fed it. The fans fed it. The band fed it back. By the mid-1990s, Oasis were no longer just making music. They were carrying a national argument about class, culture, youth, masculinity, and what kind of Britain wanted to look at itself in the mirror. Naturally, everyone handled this calmly. The newspapers turned everything into a battle. Oasis versus Blur, North versus South, lads versus art school, anthems versus cleverness, beer versus cheekbones. It was childish. It was brilliant. It sold very well, and in the middle of it, Oasis kept getting bigger. Too big for clubs. Too big for modesty, too big for the small rooms where a band can still hear itself think. The next stop was Knebworth, a field full of people, a band at the summit, a generation singing back at them, and the moment Oasis became so huge that coming down was almost guaranteed to hurt. Knebworth looked like a coronation, 250,000 people across 2 nights, a sea of bodies, flags, smoke, sweat, expectation. The kind of crowd that does not simply watch a band. It confirms a religion. For Oasis, Knebworth was proof that the impossible had become routine. A group from Manchester had reached the point where the audience seemed to stretch beyond music and into national memory. This was not just a concert, it was Britain telling itself a story. That story went like this. Ordinary lads had beaten the system, taken the biggest stage, and made the whole country shout the same songs. Beautiful, dangerous, a little ridiculous. Exactly the sort of thing Oasis were built for. But the summit has a cruel design flaw. There's nowhere higher to stand. After Knebworth, the band had a problem success never warns you about. What do you do after becoming the thing you dreamed about? You can get better. You can get quieter. You can get wiser, or you can get louder and hope nobody notices the fear. Oasis chose loud, not always musically, spiritually. Everything grew, the expectations, the egos, the headlines, the drug stories, the pressure, the demand that every new song must sound like history walking into the room again. That is a stupid demand. Naturally, everyone made it. The band had created music that made people feel young and invincible. Now the audience wanted that feeling refilled on command. Very reasonable. Just bottle youth again, lads. No pressure. The trouble was that Oasis had sold confidence so well that admitting uncertainty became almost impossible. The brand did not allow hesitation. The brand required swagger, even when swagger was starting to look like panic in a parka. Knebworth should have been a victory they could build from. Instead, it became a shadow. Every album after it had to answer the same unfair question. Is this as big as the moment when everyone believed? The answer was usually no, because almost nothing is. And when a band cannot outgrow its own peak, the peak starts turning into a cliff. The next album would not simply be music, it would be proof of what success had done to them. And the proof came swollen, expensive, and very, very loud. Be Here Now arrived like a limousine crashing through a pub wall. Big songs, big guitars, big expectations, big everything. Subtlety did not attend the sessions. It probably could not find parking. At first, the album was treated like another victory. Of course it was. Oasis were still massive. The country was still watching. Fans still wanted to believe the ride had no brakes. But after the first rush, the hangover arrived. The record began to feel like a document of excess. Not because it had no power, it did. But because the power sounded inflated, as if the band was trying to make every song large enough to hide the fact that the center was getting unstable. That is what fame can do. It gives you every tool, then quietly removes judgment. The world had told Oasis they were important, and Oasis believed it loudly. Again, who can blame them completely? If millions of people scream your songs back at you, modesty begins to look like bad manners. But the music press started turning. The same machine that had crowned them now discovered the joy of disappointment. Very noble work. Build the statue. Complain that the statue is too tall. For Oasis, this was the beginning of a new phase. Not failure exactly, but suspicion. Were they still the future? Or were they becoming their own tribute act? The band kept moving. More records, more tours, more lineup changes, more interviews that sounded like verbal broken glass. The songs still had moments. The crowd still came. The name still meant something huge. But the golden certainty had cracked. The early Oasis had sounded like escape. Now Oasis often sounded like a band trying to escape Oasis. That is a harder job, because you can leave a city, you can leave a label, you can leave a stage. But leaving the version of yourself that made millions of people love you? That is almost impossible. The band had become a machine powered by nostalgia before it was even old. And the brotherly conflict, once treated like comic fuel, began to look less funny. The jokes were not just jokes anymore. The insults were not just promotion anymore. The chaos was not just rock and roll anymore. It was becoming the story. And when the story becomes the fight, the music has to start competing with the damage. At some point, Oasis became two things at once, a band and a public argument with guitars. The songs still mattered. They always mattered. That is why anyone cared about the fights in the first place. Without the songs, the chaos would have been just another group of loud men making everyone tired. There are plenty of those. But because the songs were enormous, the conflict became enormous too. Every insult traveled. Every interview had a fuse. Every rumor sounded possible because the band had trained the public to expect disaster with a setlist. The media loved it. Of course they did. A stable band is nice, a brilliant unstable band is content. Oasis became a rolling headline factory. Cancellations, arguments, walkouts, comments, counter-comments, tension, reconciliation, more tension. The whole circus began to feel like part of the ticket price. That is the ugly exchange. Fans wanted the anthems. The press wanted the blood. The band gave both. By the 2000s, Oasis still had power, but the atmosphere had changed. The original lineup had shifted. The Britpop moment had passed. The world that made Oasis feel like a national rescue had moved on to other sounds, other drugs, other hairstyles, other forms of public stupidity. But Oasis survived. That matters. They were not a one-album miracle. They were not a brief noise. They kept playing to huge crowds because the connection was real. Those songs had entered people's lives. A song heard at 16 does not leave just because critics get bored. Still, survival is not the same as peace. The band moved forward like a house with cracks in the foundation and fresh paint on the walls. From a distance, it looked fine. Up close, you could hear things shifting. The old chemistry was now mixed with exhaustion. The brother war had become familiar. And familiar danger is sometimes the most dangerous kind. People stop treating it like a warning. They call it personality. They call it passion. They call it Oasis being Oasis. Very convenient. Then came the final tour. The old tension followed them across Europe. And in Paris, behind the stage, the story that had been building for years finally found its last room. The end of Oasis was shocking. It was not surprising. There is a difference. By the time the band reached that festival in Paris, the idea of an Oasis implosion had been in the air for years. Bands joked about it. Journalists predicted it. The band seemed to walk around with a storm cloud that had learned the tour schedule. Then the storm stopped waiting. Backstage, before the Rock on Seine performance, the argument broke open. Accounts of the details vary, because rock disasters always develop extra decoration after impact. But the result was clear enough. The show was cancelled. Noel Gallagher left the band. Oasis were finished. Just like that, a band that had filled fields, soundtracked a generation, conquered charts, humiliated subtlety, and made millions feel larger than life, ended in a place the audience could not see. Not on stage. Backstage. That is almost perfect. The public version of Oasis had always been huge. Crowds, choruses, interviews, headlines, stadiums. But the final blow happened behind a closed door, in the human space where the mythology could not help them. The songs could not fix it. The fans could not sing it away. The old swagger could not turn it into victory. A cancelled show is a brutal object. It tells the truth without poetry. People came for music. They got absence. That was the final Oasis performance in its most honest form, expectation turning into silence. Afterward came statements, blame, solo careers, new bands, more insults, lawsuits, interviews, jokes, and years of public distance. The war did not end with the band. It simply changed venues. Now the stage was the media. The audience was the internet. Very dignified, very modern. But beneath the comedy, something real had happened. Oasis had not only split. They had broken the promise their songs had made, the promise that the noise could carry people out of ordinary life. For the fans, the breakup hurt because the songs had meant escape. And suddenly the band itself looked trapped. By pride, by history, by family, by the pressure of being Oasis forever. That is why people kept waiting. Not just for a reunion, for proof that the thing that tore itself apart had not been the whole truth. The years after Oasis proved something uncomfortable. The band was gone. The songs were not. That is the thing about anthems. They do not ask permission from the people who made them. Once released, they move into other lives and start paying rent in memory. Weddings, funerals, football crowds, teenage bedrooms, drunk nights, lonely mornings, pub sing-alongs. Phones held in the air by people who were not even born when the records came out. Oasis had torn itself apart, but the music kept doing its job. That made the feud stranger. The public watched the people behind the songs keep arguing while the songs themselves kept uniting strangers. It was almost funny. Almost. A band that could not stay in the same room had made music that entire crowds could sing together without thinking. There is the tragedy. And the joke. The Gallaghers went their own ways. Different bands, different records, different interviews, different insults. The rivalry became a long-running show of its own, sometimes bitter, sometimes ridiculous, sometimes funny enough to make people forget there were real family wounds under the punchlines. But every few years, the same question returned. Will Oasis come back? Not because people needed another celebrity reunion. The world has enough of those, usually too many. People wanted Oasis back because the band had never felt finished. It had ended like a door slammed mid-sentence. No final concert, no last look, no goodbye big enough for the scale of what had happened. The story felt unresolved. And unresolved stories are very profitable. Reunion rumors became a second career. Every comment was analyzed, every softened insult became evidence, every anniversary reopened the wound, every fan grew older and still knew exactly where the chorus came in. That is power. Not hype. Power. When a band can disappear for years and still make people wait, it means something deeper survived the collapse. Then, the impossible happened. The guns fell silent, the stars aligned, the great wait ended. Oasis returned, and everyone acted surprised that the world still cared. It should not have surprised anyone. The world had never stopped singing, but the return created a dangerous question. Was this healing, or just the most expensive encore of a very old fight? Oasis made the world sing, then tore itself apart. That is the simple version. The harder version is this. Oasis gave people songs about escape, while becoming proof that not everyone can escape the thing that made them powerful. The attitude made them. The attitude damaged them. The brotherly tension gave the songs electricity. The same tension eventually made the band unlivable. The chaos made them feel real. The chaos also turned into a business model, then a prison. That is why Oasis still matters. Not because they were polite. They were not. Not because they were the most technically refined band of their era. Please. That was never the point. Oasis mattered because they understood something millions of people needed before they knew how to say it. Ordinary life can feel too small, and sometimes a song is the first place a person stands taller. That is why the collapse hurt. The band did not just lose members, it damaged a shared dream. Fans had invested emotion in Oasis because the music made life feel open. When the band fell apart, it felt like proof that even the loudest escape route can lead back into the same old room. And yet the songs survived. That is the final contradiction. Oasis could not survive Oasis, but the music could. Knebworth survived, the debut survived, the second album survived. The choruses survived bad reviews, tabloid wars, cocaine-era excess, fashion changes, solo careers, online insults, and years of public bitterness. The band broke, the sound did not. That may be the most Oasis ending possible. Messy, arrogant, funny, annoying, strangely moving despite itself. The reunion does not erase the collapse. It cannot. Too much happened, too much was said, too many years passed with the wound open in public. But maybe that is why people still care. Oasis never offered a clean story. They offered a loud one. A story about wanting more, getting too much, wasting some of it, fighting over the rest, and somehow leaving behind songs big enough to outlive the damage. The world sang because Oasis made escape sound possible. Oasis tore itself apart because escape was the one thing the band never mastered. And that is the tragedy. Not that they ended, but that they became exactly the kind of chaos their best songs once helped people rise above.